January 1947 was supposed to be a time of silence and recovery for Britain. World War II had ended just 18 months earlier, and the country, though exhausted, was slowly returning to civilian life. But nature had prepared a blow for which preparation was impossible. On January 23rd, the first massive snowfall hit the islands, marking the beginning of the harshest climatic trial in modern British history. Over the next few weeks, the country literally disappeared under a white shroud. Temperatures plummeted to record lows, and snowstorms were relentless, creating drifts up to 7 meters high. This was not merely bad weather. It was an ice siege that paralyzed the entire state. The core of the problem lay in the fact that post-war Britain was critically dependent on coal. Yet coal was freezing inside the mines, and the railways were blocked by snow. Freight trains stood motionless in the drifts, and fuel could not reach the power stations. Soon, the government was forced to take extreme measures. Electricity supply to homes was restricted to just a few hours a day, and industry virtually ground to a halt. People who had only recently hidden in cellars from German bombs were now huddling in blankets in their unheated homes, watching frost coat the interior walls of their rooms. Food was still rationed, but with roads blocked, trucks carrying bread and milk simply could not reach the towns. Visually, the Britain of 1947 resembled the Arctic. Newspapers of the time were filled with headlines about the battle for survival. In the countryside, villages were completely cut off from the outside world for weeks. The only way to contact them was through radio broadcasts and occasional Royal Air Force planes dropping supplies onto snow-covered fields. Birds froze in mid-flight, and livestock perished in their pens, unable to escape the snow. It was a time of national shock. The victors of the greatest war in human history found themselves helpless in the face of ordinary snow and frost. No one then could have imagined that this frozen wasteland was merely a prelude to an even greater disaster. This entire titanic mass of ice and snow had turned into a ticking time bomb, waiting for just one thing: the first thaw. In mid-March 1947, Britain seemed to receive its long-awaited deliverance. The icy easterly wind was replaced by mild Atlantic air. But the residents' joy was short-lived. The warming didn't just arrive, it practically slammed into the country, accompanied by tropical downpours and gale-force winds. Within a few days, temperatures jumped from deep sub-zero to 10 degrees Celsius. Billions of tons of snow and ice, accumulated over 3 months of anomalous winter, began to melt simultaneously across the entire territory of the islands. However, a fatal problem arose, which meteorologists call the concrete floor effect. The soil, frozen to a depth of over half a meter, was hard as rock and could not absorb a single drop of moisture. All the meltwater, combined with the torrential rain, rushed from the hills and fields into the lowlands, seeking an outlet. The only path lay through the riverbeds, but these were still choked with giant blocks of ice. As a result, the rivers turned into uncontrollable torrents, carrying ice debris, uprooted trees, and rubbish. Ice jams under bridges acted like dams. Water built up behind them and then burst through, creating a powerful wave that demolished everything in its path. Flood defenses and dikes, many of which had not been repaired since pre-war times due to a lack of resources, began to give way under the colossal pressure. This was the critical moment. What had begun as a joyful end to winter turned into a biblical flood within hours. The water rose with such speed that residents of riverside settlements did not even have time to grab their essentials. The rise in water levels in the Thames, Trent, and Severn was the most rapid ever recorded. Britain found itself trapped. The ground was too cold to accept the water, and the rivers were too choked with ice to lead it away. A huge part of England began to slowly but inexorably sink beneath the murky, icy water, and stopping this process was impossible. The country, having just survived an icy captivity, stood face to face with the most destructive force of nature. By the 20th of March 1947, the scale of the disaster had become truly national. Britain's most powerful river system, the Thames, burst its banks for hundreds of miles. This was no ordinary seasonal overflow. It was a full-scale invasion. In London and its suburbs, such as Windsor, Maidenhead, and Richmond, the water rose to the level of the second floors. The capital of what was once the world's greatest empire suddenly turned into a northern likeness of Venice, but without its romance. Through the streets where famous red buses had recently roamed, army boats and makeshift rafts, hammered together from doors and garden furniture, now navigated. The scene was surreal. Only the tops of lampposts, the roofs of submerged cars, and road signs pointing to nowhere were visible above the water's surface. People who had celebrated the victory over Nazism just 2 years prior found themselves in the position of refugees once again. Thousands of families were trapped on the upper floors of their homes without electricity, gas, or clean water. The only way to communicate with the outside world was through shouts for help from windows or waving white bedsheets. The night streets of London plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of flowing water and the cracking of collapsing structures. The situation in the countryside was even more catastrophic. In the fens of eastern England, the water breached dikes and flooded vast areas, turning arable land into an endless inland sea. Small villages became islands, completely cut off from civilization. The murky, icy water carried animal carcasses, furniture debris, and toxic silt from the sewers. It was a time of deep psychological breaking for the nation. After all the hardships of the war, the British had hoped for peace and quiet, but instead they received an element that took their last possessions, their homes, and their sense of security in their own land. For a Britain still living under a rationing system, the 1947 flood was not just a natural disaster, but a threat of national famine. The water swallowed over 600,000 acres of the country's most fertile land. Winter crops were completely destroyed, and spring sowing became impossible. But the most horrific sight was the mass death of livestock. Hundreds of thousands of sheep and cattle, weakened by the long winter, drowned in the icy currents or died of hypothermia while trapped in flooded pens. For a country that had just emerged from war, this was a crushing blow to food security. In this critical situation, the government was forced to mobilize the army. A unique rescue operation began, dubbed the Domestic Dunkirk. UKW amphibians and pontoons, which just a couple of years earlier had stormed the beaches of Normandy, were deployed to flooded city streets and rural areas. Soldiers in rubber boots and heavy machinery became the only link to the world for thousands of people. They delivered bread, milk, and clean water directly to second-floor windows, evacuated the sick, and tried to reinforce dikes with sandbags under the relentless rain. It was a true war against water. Military engineers used explosives to break up ice jams under bridges that were acting as dams. Across the country, volunteers united to feed those left homeless. The British Blitz spirit manifested once again. People who had lost all their possessions shared their last piece of bread. Despite the scale of the destruction, army discipline and civil solidarity helped avoid even greater loss of life, though the economic and agricultural damage was so vast that Britain had to request additional aid from its allies, acknowledging its total vulnerability in the face of the elements. When the water finally began to recede in April 1947, it left behind a Britain that was hard to recognize. Fields were coated in a layer of toxic silt, hundreds of bridges were destroyed, and over 100,000 homes were in need of major repairs. The total damage was estimated in the hundreds of millions of pounds, an astronomical sum for a country on the brink of bankruptcy after the war. But the most important outcome was a complete shift in the national consciousness. The 1947 flood clearly demonstrated that the old Victorian methods of water protection no longer worked. Britain realized that its primary threat now came not from the air, but from the rivers that had once been its pride. This disaster became the catalyst for the River Acts of 1948 and subsequent massive engineering projects. It was the scars left by the 1947 flood that forced scientists and engineers to begin designing the protections that, decades later, would manifest in the famous Thames Barrier. New early warning systems were created, and thousands of miles of reinforced dikes were built. The government understood that water control was a matter of national security, as vital as border defense. The lessons of that terrible spring formed the foundation of all of Britain's modern infrastructure. Today, when we look at the calm flow of the Thames or the green fields of England, it is hard to imagine that beneath them lies the memory of the Great Trial of 1947. It was the final chapter in a long series of hardships for the post-war generation. Yet it was this very chapter that laid the foundation of safety for future generations. Britain emerged from that water different, more cautious, technically equipped, and ready for nature's challenges. The story of the 1947 flood remains a reminder that even the greatest nations can be brought to their knees by the elements, and that a country's true strength is revealed in its ability to rise from the ruins and draw lessons from its darkest hours.